All right, great day, Gadfly subscribers. It's Carlos. Hopefully, everyone's having a great day today. Today is Wednesday. I have to look again, Paul. June the 17th.
Yeah.
I say that every podcast that we do. I want to thank all of our subscribers for your support to the Gadfly multi-channel network. We could not do the work that we're doing without your support. So also, please make sure we did create some social platforms as well. So jump over to Twitter, where you can find us at the Gadfly MCN, and then also a Facebook page as well there, which is the Gadfly. And very excited today. I'm joined by London Paul of the Sears Report. And please also support Paul's work over at thesearsreport.com. Check out his premium content, which is his daily podcast that I'm a subscriber to as well. And Paul, great day. How are you, sir?
Yes, we're very well. I was saying to you, it's quite humid and we had a lot of thunderstorms, but generally we've had wonderful weather for over 3 months now in January. We've had odd, but by UK standards, it's amazing. So we shouldn't complain. But life's kind of getting back to normal-ish. But things are starting to open up and whatever. And on a personal note, I might finally be able to get my haircut in the next week or two. Now they're opening hairdressers again, because my hair grows extremely quickly and it is extremely long.
well, perhaps Lisa could take some shears to it, Paul, and get
Yeah,
creative.
yeah, she could do, but no, I've kind of got someone who cuts my hair all the time, and she knows exactly what to do, and just so that, yeah, I mean, it's things. I mean, things are returning to normal gradually, and it hasn't. I mean, I don't think it's hugely impacted our lives. I mean, probably less than a lot of people, but that's just your individual circumstances. But anyway, it is what it is, and life moves on, and I'm not going to dwell too much on it. I've got enough to get on with and be concerned about, rather than worrying about what's going to happen in that regard, because after all, I don't have any control or influence over it anyway. As much as we'd all like to see things done differently, I don't doubt that.
Yep, absolutely, Paul. And it's very interesting on a daily basis to watch the struggle for if you will, to the narrative. And I think what we talked before we went live, that specifically what we're looking at is a very much a power struggle that is taking place, and it's being played out directly in front of us, Paul.
Yeah, I mean, look, we're going to pick our way. I'll have to try and go quite slowly. I mean, to put some context in this, I'm kind of going to discuss, in some senses, things I originally covered in my own podcast I think it was around about a year ago. I mean, I don't often recycle material, but I don't think my own subscribers, because I know there's quite a lot of them who subscribe to the Gadfly as well, are going to be particularly bothered that I discuss this, but it will give people some insight into the kind of things and the depth of information and we go into. But the problem with the whole administration with Trump since 2016, I mean, there was no doubt. I think I was one of the first people to say, before Trump stood for the presidency, and that he'll be the next US president provided they don't kill him. And that was a very crude analogy, but of course he subsequently became president, and there was an enormous amount of euphoria because. And I was led to believe there was going to be enormous big changes. But what we saw really is a clear indication for the last, 3.5 years that, normally with the presidents, there are elements that have different kind of ideas of how the US should be run on what if you want to call it, a deep state basis or special interest group. But they kind of more or less have just agreed to disagree on certain things, and they find a way to coexist and within the political structure of two parties and within the presidential situation. But I think once Trump was elected, then it was open warfare between these groups, and which is why we've seen this never-ending aim of the Russiagate debacle, which was nonsense, the impeachment of Trump, which was nonsense. And, we've said it many times before, really the Trump administration is being hijacked. I mean, deep state, I think there's special interest groups, there's a whole bunch of things who completely co-opted his administration. He's not doing anything that he was supposed to do. and which he intended to do. I mean, you would have to listen to him prior to the election and his inauguration. So, and this is why the US is the way it is politically, and we've never seen such this vehement hatred between different rival groups. I mean, the only things they tend to agree on is the military budget, because the military industrial complex is kind of sacrosanct to the United States. It's a bit like the equivalent of our National Health Service. No one is allowed to tinker with it or change it. So everyone just agrees, but there's an enormous amount of clear indications that there are factions within this deep state special interest groups who are now openly at war with each other, and that's why we're seeing it play out within the realms of the Democrats and the Republicans. It's not, I mean, the political systems is this illusion, but it's playing out in that realm because there's no other way it can play out. So what I thought would be worth doing is sort of going into some level of detail as to what these deep state special interest groups are. There's an awful lot of stuff in the alt media that says a whole bunch of things that for me is not as really representative of what it is. It's not all wrong, but it's most certainly not all right. And we can start off, I mean, and it's very convoluted. Let's be honest, we can talk in very broad terms, but effectively, one big element of this, which won't surprise anyone, is what people call the military-industrial complex. That has an enormous say on US defense spending, or the US budget has an enormous say in terms of which nations the US arms, and which can be very controversial. Also, effectively, they're the ones driving the US to go to war. They're the ones driving the US for regime change and all these things, because they're huge beneficiaries financially. And then, of course, there's all the sort of neocon element, which certainly exists, and unfortunately has hijacked a lot of the Trump administration. They're a big part, and they're kind of tied in with the whole military-industrial complex. And I think that's a fairly reasonable statement to make when you look at what's happened in the Trump administration. Yeah, there's absolutely no doubt we had all the Arab Spring and we had Ukraine, and there's no doubt the Obama administration was responsible for an enormous amount of bombing missions, and they were involved in Syria, of course. So we're not saying it doesn't exist, but it's kind of accelerated in one sense. There's Trump there saying, well, I want to bring all the forces home. He was very clear. Well, as yet, that hasn't happened, and the US is not pulled out of Syria. It's meddling in Iraq. It's trying to meddle in Iran. It's trying to meddle in Afghanistan, and meddling in North Africa and other parts of Africa. It's meddling in Venezuela and Nicaragua and Cuba, and the list goes on. It's meddling in Hong Kong. It's trying to meddle everywhere, and so it's kind of become a sort of standard policy, almost on steroids. It's not as obvious. There's not as many overt wars as we've seen in previous administrations, but it's still a continuation. And of course, with regards to the likes of Afghanistan, during the Trump administration, they dropped more bombs than any other administration. So there's an indication of a silent war going on, and the media's largely blacked this out. There's not many indications of what the US is doing, and that's by design, of course. Now, the other side of that equation, which this will surprise people, is there's that broad element. There's another element, which is all these financial institutions, corporations. They're the kind of globalist element. The other element aren't really interested in globalization in that sense. They're quite isolationist, hence Let's Make America Great Again, which I'm sure most people are aware, but that was originally a strapline for Ronald Reagan. So it wasn't something that Trump invented. That may be a bit of a surprise to some people, but this globalist element exists on this side, and then of course they have links into what you might term the executive branch. That's the presidency of the US, and there's all these peripheral organizations. They do have some relation to these core financial institutions, corporations, etc. and they're significant to some extent, but they have different priorities, and really they're not kind of directly part of the deep state. This shows already just how convoluted the situation is now. There's a lot of executives who are also a big part of this play into the executive branch that are executives. They're of a really small group of all these corporations. They've got a lot of cross affiliation, and of course then you've got the media, and of course you have the likes of the NSA, which of course when the light was shone on them, that's why they're so angry with Snowden in that regard. And then there's all the surveillance and the FBI, etc., etc. Now, the executive branch, though, is entirely influenced and controlled purely by corporate interests. Ultimately, the military-industrial complex is a corporate interest. Yeah, it has to manifest it in horrendous situations like wars, regime change, etc. But at the end of the day, if they're going to sell bombs, they're going to sell planes, they're going to sell missiles, whatever, missile defense systems, whatever it is, they have to have a reason to do this. That's another reason why we have all these convenient bogeymen that exist to, justify why they have to be in the vicinity of North Korea or China or Russia, because otherwise there'd be no justification to have that kind of corporate interest military industrial complex. Now, of course, there are four principal organizations which some people will be aware, certainly people are aware of. The Council on Foreign Relations, that's one. Ones that people may not be aware of is called the Business Roundtable. You can Google it, go and have a look at it. There's the American Bankers Association and the US Chamber of Commerce. They're four main areas. Now, two of those, the Council on Foreign Relations and the Business Roundtable particularly, are very influential in terms of their access and how they try to, of course, shall we say, not dictate, but certainly influence the executive branch, i.e., the presidency of the United States. And the thing with the Council on Foreign Relations and the Business Roundtable, they may exist as individual entities, but they're very much cross-pollinating at all times. And of course, in a way, the control of the executive branch, of course, has always been the corporate mass media, which of course is crumbling, which is a big, huge problem for them. And that's something that, of course, is particularly interesting and rankles within this war, within what we're seeing now, is because Trump's railing after the corporate mass media. We know this; he's really gunning for them. So that's another reason why it's a clear evidence that there is this warring factions within this deep state special interest groups structure. Because, correct me if I'm wrong, I've never seen any of the US president railing against the mainstream media as we've seen with the Trump administration. So, maybe we'll stop there, and if you want to just say anything, CJ, I don't want to just keep rambling because
that's fine,
quite
Paul.
detailed.
And I think it's important, to understand that this has existed for years upon years in the United States. It's nothing new. It had the likes of the mind from the Reagan administration to the Clinton administration to Obama. I mean, this is nothing that has been established in the last 3 or 4 years, and it's very unfortunate. And these are truth matters that are occurring, and why people are so much today losing faith in the two-party system itself, Paul, is that the likes and minds that the illusion of choice, that one political party is going to make a difference or the other, when they have already pretty much sold their souls out to these massive corporations, these influential think tanks that pretty much steer U.S. policy, both foreign and domestic, Paul.
Yeah, exactly, and that's why it's kind of, it's really purely corporate interests ultimately. And yeah, there's a lot of ways that corporate interests dominate, but that's why all this idea that they want, and I'm not saying surveillance doesn't exist and all this, but there's no need for them to have police states as people have been led to believe, or the surveillance the way people have been led to believe, because, which I know, yes, of course they exist, but why do they need that? Big corporations just do what big corporations do, and they don't care whether you and I disagree with them or dissent against them. But that's why as well this power structure is in serious trouble, because big corporations are now in serious trouble financially, as much as anything else. And this has been going on, of course, not since the lockdown and the coronavirus, but it's been going back for many years, and they've been in serious declines since 2008 and before that in some senses. Hence why now there's this big mandate from the US Treasury via the Fed to bail everything out, because in a way the deep state needs bailing out, which is the big corporation. That's why they'll always look after the big corporations and the banks, because the banks are conduits for big corporations. If the banks don't exist, how do big corporations trade? But it's a very, very different mindset than this idea that there's this big nefarious thing to have, martial law and control everyone the way that it's being led to believe, because they don't need to do that. And why would they do that? They can well, okay, the wheels are falling off now, but that's got nothing to do with the fact that they don't have us under 24/7 surveillance. And here's the other thing. Does anyone seriously think they have the resources to have 330 million people under surveillance 24 hours, 7 days a week? Absolutely not. Yeah, if there's a reason and suddenly someone becomes extremely subversive, then they may decide to surveil them on an individual basis. I'm not saying all data isn't recorded, but the chances are 99.99% of Americans may have data that's recorded, but it's never going to ever be accessed because they have no reason to. So it's just taking something that surveillance and police structure has existed for decades and beyond. It's just been blown out of proportion because it's a great way, again, of alt media scaring people half to death that there's these awful things coming in. And of course, they bolt in the whole Orwellian thing, which, Orwell wrote a book in 1948, which bears, but doesn't mean it bears any resemblance to the reality of what's unfolding now. Yeah, it's a very dystopian view of the world, and people will say, well, Orwell had connections with all these people. Well, lots of people in history have written books with who are connected, and nothing they've ever said's come to reality. So we can easily cherry pick things we think to justify, a belief system, but we're not saying things don't exist. And absolutely, there are police and surveillance power of the likes of the FBI. But what people don't realize is the Business Roundtable and the Council of Foreign Relations has got a partnership with what's known as the Domestic Security Alliance Council. And they're all interwoven as well. And this DSAC is comprised of these Business Roundtable and Council of Foreign Relations corporations. And it is, from what I understand, members of this DSA have access to security information, not only from the FBI, but from federal government entities. So you've got Department of Homeland Security, the IRS, FEMA, etc., 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 etc. Now that is a part that isn't known, but of course, if they're significant in this pyramid of the deep state special interest groups, then is it any surprise that they do have access to that level of information? Absolutely not. But what this tells you is it's big corporation again that has access and control to everything. Now, of course, the NSA mass surveillance program was overseen, no doubt, by the executive branch, we have to be honest. But did that originate from this Business Roundtable, CFR, DSAC kind of cooperation or trilateral kind of arrangement? Very likely. And that's why when you look at Council for Foreign Relation members. A lot of them, they existed under the Bush and Obama administration, and obviously you can see some cross correlation, between the kind of DSAC and all the surveillance and their influence inside the government, be it overtly or covertly. So now you start to see this is incredibly convoluted and complicated. But as I keep saying, it's principally revolves around the fact that you have these enormous corporations and executives of corporations who have an enormous say in the how the executive branch operates. No doubt, you've got surveillance. You've got also, of course, you've got all the intelligence agencies, which, of course, are feeding administrations full of absolute bogus nonsense about what Russia's doing here and China's doing there, and what Syria's doing with chemical weapons attacks, which is, of course, utter nonsense in the process. But think about it. What was the basis of the war in Syria? If Assad had let corporate interests put their pipelines across his land, which allows corporate interests to pump oil, etc., a huge kind of profit to themselves, we would have never had the war. But we had the war because Assad wasn't allowing them to do it, and Assad, in fact, wanted to work with interests that don't align with these special interest groups. So it's kind of a double whammy. If they get cut off with their ability for trade and commerce through Syria, they'll launch a war because it's profitable. I mean, a war is profitable for them as well. On the other flip side, I mean, this is where this distinction comes, where you've got the military-industrial complex, which isn't really part of sort of corporate special interests and financial institutions, etc. They are separate, but they'll coexist because there's mutual, interest and benefit for them to do so. And Syria is one example where obviously, ultimately, military-industrial complex benefits to be in Syria because it makes enormous profit. And of course, it'll arm all these militants and terrorists because, and that's why they use proxies, so it's harder to identify specific American interests. But the plan was, and of course it's failed, was to get rid of Assad. And once Assad's gone, then they can trade, commerce, or corporations move in and do what they wanted to do before Assad said, excuse me, you're not going to do it. That's one small example of that. And of course, there is other objectives that no doubt exist, which is to nullify the likes of China and nullify the likes of Russia, hence why we had the Maidan, why they wanted to cripple Russia economically. That is less about pumping huge amounts of money in. Well, I mean, yeah, they wanted to start a war, which they would have profited from. They eventually thought, well, we can completely take over Ukraine. We can then build Ukraine out, make huge, enormous profits financially from doing this, and then we can push and extend ourselves to the Russian border. But of course, Donbass wouldn't allow that. So yeah, it's not absolutely straightforward. It's a little bit, it is convoluted, but there are broad objectives, and all these sides traditionally have kind of got along, but they most certainly are not getting along currently. And that's why, in a sense, you've got the situation where the Trump administration's kind of warring at the Federal Reserve, although partly, of course, because the US Treasury controls the Federal Reserve, but the Federal Reserve was pushing back and didn't want to do the things that they were effectively being told to do, because and of course they have interest to do with the financial system, and the financial system is financial institutions and banks and the corporations. So that's one element within this power structure. So there is definitely, but then of course on the flip side is Trump then wants tons of money pumped in here, there, and everywhere to prop up his administration and stop it collapsing. And of course, the military-industrial complex doesn't mind if it has enormous amounts of money and it has this huge budget. And of course, corporations want the huge amount of budget as well because they don't want their corporations going bust, and that's why they'll buy anything and everything. So sometimes there's points of mutual interest. There's the current Trump administration where in some ways they're warring with another faction of special interest, but at some point it's kind of like if they don't come together and agree, they'll just destroy each other. So, and when it's a point when each side is looking at each other going, well, we'll destroy each other, they're going to go, no, I'm not going to do that. If they can destroy the other side, yes, they'd like to do that, but not when it's mutually when mutual destruction. Then obviously it's a different situation. So, of course, when you look at the situation and you factor in what we've just discussed, it makes a lot more sense what has gone on with the Trump administration for 3.5 years or so. Now we can see why there's been this endless element that has tried to take down the Trump administration and will continue to do so. The only thing I think that was puzzling with regards to the opposition, which is clearly aligning itself with the Democrats in this situation, is that why they ended up with Biden beggars belief. There would have been stronger candidates than Biden to stand against Trump. And I mean, relatively speaking, of course, we're not saying any of them are really of any great shakes, but whether you like him, dislike him, I would have thought it would be reasonable to suggest that Sanders would have been a better option from this rival element of deep state operatives to want him as the Democrat presidential candidate rather than Biden. But at the end of the day, the point with all this is neither element, neither the Trump administration or whoever's going to come in is of any benefit to the US. That's the gigantic sell where people are believing that, rather like they did with Obama, there's going to be this wonderful change, which of course never happened. And now there's people who are very hardcore Trump supporters who believe all this change is going to happen, and of course it's not happened. But ultimately, you've got worried factions. Trump's probably just in the middle of this somewhere now, wondering what the hell is going on. I mean, I think personally, if you look at him lately, he seems extremely strained. He looks like he's been under a huge amount of pressure for his entire administration, but I think, to me, it's starting to look like it's taking its toll on him. And is it any wonder? I don't think I would have been particularly thrilled to have gone through. As much as I'm critical of him, he's had 3.5 years of hell now. He hasn't helped himself at times, but that's a whole separate issue. I don't think any other president, certainly in my lifetime, has been under that amount of duress and strain, which is absolutely irrefutable. So. But I think in a very broad sense, that's probably another good point to stop.
Yeah, there were great points, Paul, and you can pretty much look through and see several instances where there was an attempt to rehabilitate the relationship with Russia, the attempt to rehabilitate relationships with China, and unfortunately, some of the controlling actors just simply would not allow that to happen. In the minds of many, the reason why Obama was so successful was because of his social justice practices and implementations here in the U.S. But at the same time, he played ball with the military-industrial complex. He allowed the expansion of the wars in Afghanistan. He allowed the escalation in Syria. So therefore, they allowed him to implement some of those policies and not create really any type of disruption here in the U.S. And likewise, when you look at, good.
No, carry on.
Yeah. So then when you look at like Trump coming in and trying to make significant change to U.S. policy, much like the medical community, there's no profits to make in curing disease. Is the same thing with the military-industrial complex and the massive amount spent on military. Is there's no money to be made in peacetime, Paul.
No, and sadly, absolutely not. And you make a great point about Obama. And of course, what did Obama do as well? He was, he kept globalization on the table. He kept he went through the great, the 2008, 2009, great financial crisis, and he kept the banks afloat. and he did everything which appeased and pleased that that element of the sort of special interest groups and corporations. I mean, he gave 0 interest rates and QE, and he did everything to support them. So in essence, he wasn't deemed a significant threat. Well, I think the truth is, if you heard Trump before he became president, my goodness, it was very clear. I mean, we were talking, and you could see that it looked extremely promising because he was making all the right noises like no other candidate has. But of course, once he got into office, it was an entirely different matter. But whilst I will obviously give him latitude in that sense, I think the idea that he's going to be this miraculous turnaround if he gets re-elected is really just not realistic. I mean, never say never, and maybe something incredible will happen. But after 3.5 years, there's, I'm sorry, no indication whatsoever that's going to come to pass. But when you look at the structure I've just laid out, you can then see why effectively it works within how this power structure works, and why it's just big corporate interests that control America. And big corporate interests needs people like you and me. They need us to be able to be, the little sort of worker bees to generate their massive profits in business. They need us. They don't not want us. Okay, they don't want us to be rich, and they want us to do just enough just to so we have to slave away, for whatever 50 weeks a year in the US, or whatever 48, 46 weeks in the year in the UK, and work yourself to death and all those things, of course. But that's a byproduct. It's not. There's not some big nefarious plan to put everyone in FEMA camps and do that. That's just not part of their agenda. And why would it be? But of course, they want to expand their influence, and they want to be able to extend their corporate interests, and that's why they don't want to come back to the US and be isolated, because then they're not corporate interests anymore. They're just domestic companies and that doesn't suit their needs. So that's another reason why you've got these competing elements railing against each other. I mean, yeah, and of course they're not going to be openly at war. They have to it has to manifest itself where it plays out in this illusionary realm of the political system. So when one element really is railing against the other, then they'll take one side of the political spectrum. And although I have to say, typically big corporations, big business, those kind of things do tend to align themselves more with the Democrat side of the equation in that sort of political illusionary world, rather than the Republican side. Not exclusively by any means, but if you look at the way things are now, there's a lot more of that side of the equation who seem to be more currently sympathetic with the Democrat side, because of course that's where that part of this deep state is aligning itself. So it creates this kind of illusion in the American people's eyes of a robust political system. And that's why if you back the left or you back the right, you're wasting your time, because neither has any interest, as we said before, in furthering the aims and what should be achieved for the American people. But I think what's also worth talking about this Domestic Security Alliance Council is there's no doubt that there's a board, a big sort of, and that's composed of a lot of these corporate people. So from the Business Roundtable and to a lesser extent the CFR. I think the majority are from the Business Roundtable. And of course, when you comprise all this, there's corporations, of course, that are close, cross-affiliated with the Council on Foreign Relations and vice versa. So, but it seems, if you really want to say who really is at the sort of peak of this this structure, it's probably the Business Roundtable more than anything. And of course, as we say, that this BORT, as they're abbreviated, and the Council on Foreign Relations are also, as we say, intermingled with this kind of the internal surveillance program, and which actually I think there is a mass surveillance program that isn't well known, and actually would completely, if you look at the what the NSA does is nothing compared to this. Right. Now, when you say mass surveillance, that could be a lot of data crunching. That can just be getting profiled. That's a way of understanding the target markets. I mean, mass surveillance can mean many different things. I don't think they're surveying people because of their political beliefs or anything like that. But we know that there are big entities that have accumulated enormous amounts of personal data, and that is a statement of fact. We're not kind of making that up by any stretch of the imagination. So in many senses, what's one thing worth mentioning is the Business Roundtable was actually originally called the Business Council, and that came about in, I think it was around the 1930s during the Great Depression era. And that was some sort of advisory group at that point to the federal government. And of course, it's morphed into this Business Roundtable. But the members of the Business Council were at the time presidents of large US-based corporations. So you can just basically see how this has all kind of manifested itself in the process. And and it does, of course, include people from big name companies, big banks, big corporations, etc. So, which are very, very familiar names to people. Now, of course, the other thing is they'll be behind these enormous kind of trade agreements. Some, very questionable. I mean, you've got NAFTA, which obviously subsequently got booted out, and then you've got. But here's the point. I mean, look at this. They had NAFTA, which, not saying it benefits the likes of you or I or any individual Canadian or Mexican, but what did the Trump administration do? It wanted to destroy it, wanted the end to it. But has anything subsequently come about? I mean, this thing, there's all this talk within the elements controlling the Trump administration. Oh yeah, we're really keen on trade, but think about every agreement they're supposed to have reached. None of them have ever come to pass. I mean, European Union, the Chinese, the replacement for NAFTA, they left the Trans-Pacific Partnership. I'm not saying we agree with that, but we're just highlighting what the Trump administration's done. So it's backing away from all these, transnational free trade agreements for all the reasons why there's definitely concern as to how they operate, and obviously how NAFTA came into existence is certainly questionable. There's not only we're going into great detail about that but if people want to read, there is kind of an enormous backstory with regards to the origins of that and how it came about. But this DSAC is huge amounts of influence, and you can see, if you want to look at people in the DSA, look at where their cross pollination is and where their influence and what they're involved in a broader sense. Now, how many people are actually even aware, for example, that this Domestic Security Alliance Council exists? I mean, I don't know. It'd be interesting from the feedback we get. But I can remember talking to a whole bunch of people about this quite a few years ago, and everyone goes, "What's that? Never heard of it. What does it do?" Oh, you mean it has some influence? No, it's very pivotal to the influence on the executive branch of the United States, and then there's the big question: to what extent is this all interwoven with all this kind of decisions made in terms of surveillance? And I think certainly there is a big question mark as to the extent to which these corporate entities actually play a role in this whole surveillance and data crunching and storage of data, and why it's used and how it's accessed, without any shadow of a doubt. And that is questionable as to the extent to what that is. But and I can't personally vouch to what that is. All I know is there's a degree of influence. And therefore the question is, to what extent are intelligence agencies and FBI and all these institutions to do with surveillance, security, and policing, to what extent are they making decisions that are beneficial to big corporate interests? So, for example, when we see certain big corporate interests who only get a tiny little slap on the wrist for banks, for example, that have been involved in money laundering for cartels and drug lords and God knows what else they've been involved in. And we always go, oh look, some token little slap on the wrist. Well, that's why, because they're all intertwined, and the influence from the corporate structure is through the whole security apparatus of the United States, which is another reason why intelligence will tell the executive branch whatever big corporate interests want to hear. So corporate interests go, we want to move into this country, or we want to get some, our foot in the door here. Okay, let's just create some bogus intelligence to give us a reason for the executive branch to go, this is horrendous, we need to go to war. Oh, Assad's launching chemical weapons again. Okay, well, we need to bomb Assad, and because ultimately corporate interests want Assad out the way, or corporate interests want to get a toehold in various countries. I mean, Afghanistan was for opium production because the US economy was cratering, and what happens? Enormous profits are accrued from opium production, which stabilized, in inverted commas, the US economy 2001-2. All the data's out there if anyone wants to look at it. And this is where we talk about people joining dots and dealing with the reality of things. And this is my biggest concern. We talk about these things, and I don't hear an awful lot of anybody else in this so-called progressive alt media talking, about what this actually means, and in reality what this deep state is. When people hear deep state, they hear all these stories about how these entities control central banks, and how these entities control everything. No, they don't. Big corporate interest controls everything in the United States, and everything's geared around what they want and why they want it. And of course, in the process, they want to squeeze as much profit and margin out of everything they possibly can, which is why, if you want to complain, I mean, yeah, okay, the Clinton administration moved US interest over to China, which stripped the manufacturing base out of America. Why did they do that? Because the big corporate interests that control everything said, we want to go there. And why do we want to go there? Because if I make, I don't know, an iPhone in the United States, my profit margin is going to be decimated than if I make it in China. And it's as simple as that. It's just purely from their perspective, pragmatic decision to make enormous profits. Now, of course, ultimately, where they failed is they allowed the banks to have all this wanton speculation, which they should never have done, which was really seriously underpinned the whole global operation. They also forgot that you can't allow the United States to become this service-based economy and has no manufacturing base, because in the end you're just going to run these enormous trade deficits, and eventually the world will say, enough's enough, we're not buying your treasuries anymore and giving you lots of free dollars to spend. So eventually, of course, their attitude, they destroyed themselves. They destroyed themselves by moving their manufacturing base out of the United States. They destroyed themselves by the fact that they just tried to constantly go around the world seeking to impose their own designs through hegemony. And of course, in the process, that just antagonized the rest of the world, who would eventually reach breaking point. So in a way, of course, they've destroyed their own empire. And of course, that's the other thing why we are where we are. I mean, Trump's a part of that equation, or the Trump administration. But in reality, even if we'd had, Clinton in there, for argument's sake, I mean, yes, some things the world might have been very different from the US perspective, but you would have still ended up with these warring factions, because their empire's collapsing, the dollar's collapsing, hegemony's collapsing, the corporations are collapsing, their ability and influence in the world is diminishing. I mean, yeah, they're desperate. I mean, despite all this anti-China sentiment, big corporations are desperate to go to China. Big financial institutions are desperate for a piece of the pie because they think it will save them. So they're desperately trying to sort of reach out and do whatever they can to survive, and that's hugely questionable as to what extent they will survive. But the point is, I think we were just that point in history. Trump's sort of a bit of a coincidence, but not entirely. Why there's all these factions in the US warring because their entire empire's collapsing, and where they previously kind of worked in unison, they had points of disagreement. Of that, there's no doubt. But I mean, and you only have to look within the Trump administration. I mean, there was no doubt that the more sort of extreme elements within the Trump administration were baying for 3 years for a war with Iran, and at the last minute, Trump pulled out and went, we're not launching a missile attack on Iran." Fortunately, he did. But of course, in the process, that was an indication that, and that probably only came about because everything's so disjointed in terms of the power structure in the US, because there's elements where the military, I feel, are sort of at the moment definitely not at war with Trump, but there's certainly this growing chasm between them because they're seeing him do things that they find very politicized, and they don't want to be part of that. They'd rather be apolitical. But I think there was certainly enormous influence brought to bear with regards to Iran. Certainly it was with regards to North Korea, although in both cases, I think that's because the US military were warned by Russia of the consequences of doing it. But it doesn't matter. But I think the military pushed back and went, "This is a bridge too far. You absolutely don't want to do this." And there's no doubt the US military, whilst Trump or whoever's the commander in chief, the structure is that they first and foremost should adhere to the Constitution. Now, we can argue whether that's reality because the US Constitution's been so ruthlessly abused by all manner of people for far too long. But in principle, that's what they adhere to, and that overrides anything the commander-in-chief says. So if they feel the US Constitution is going to be compromised, or in this case, there's a serious risk to the US, they're going to rail back and push back against the Trump administration. But it seems at those pinch points that Trump's actually listening. Well, there's elements within his administration who are going to be furious with it because the extreme elements in one side of these special interest groups are baying for a war, and they desperately want it. So he's angering elements within his administration doing this, and that's why at times there are elements who, when he first was elected, they despised him. They really, and then suddenly, when he started to look like they had a measure of control over him, they're all suddenly warming to him and think he's wonderful. But the second he strays off that path, he's no longer considered to be part of their little clique, for want of a better word. So therefore, when you look at the situation in the US and in terms of Trump, this is why often we saw him when he was first elected, where everybody disliked him because he didn't fit into the globalist agenda within this power structure. He didn't fill in with the military-industrial complex. He certainly didn't fit in with the kind of neocon extremes. He didn't fit in with the media. He fitted in with nobody. But now he's become a bit more malleable, and part of this kind of military-industrial complex kind of elements want this isolationist policy. This goes back 100 years in the US, and it's a bit and that completely, of course, challenges the whole ethos of how this globalist elements within corporations. Corporations don't want to be strangled and told to all come home. And by the way, you're not trading in China or anywhere else anymore. They're going to rail against this, and that's why there's this enormous split now, and why we've had utter chaos in the US for so long. But the important thing here is none of this is beneficial to the United States. And as you said before we came on, CJ, the American needs, for want. I mean, I put an article on our website about this third way of how people need to think differently, in the US needs an entirely different movement. It needs a movement that dispenses with mainstream politics, dispenses with the left and the right, and sits there and goes, what's beneficial to the United States and what do we really need? And the only way you're ever going to get to this is people are going to have to get rid of their binary mindset, which is very destructive, and say, I don't care if you're what political persuasion you are. What's beneficial? What elements of your belief system and our belief system can we marry together? And for me, the future is a kind of, in very loose terms, a marrying between real capitalism, real globalization, multilateralism, in the real sense of the word, not the bullshit we've seen for far too long, and elements of what people would like to term socialism. And the elements I'm talking about, as we said, aren't socialism. And you bolt them together and you make a system that works for the future. Because the elements that want to keep Trump in office are only interested in destroying the other elements so they can have free reign to rule the American people for the next decade or longer. And if they do that, they will absolutely destroy the US. They will literally gut it inside out. And that is not a future any American should want. So it's past the point of you can believe in Trump because you believe in Trump's sincerity and what he really stands for, but that's not going to help America. What helps America is a whole new kind of different way of thinking, a different way of doing things. Sadly, it should have started years ago during the Obama administration, but the alternative media, which would have been a great platform to do this, just completely veers off at pointless tangents, which is why I said, from the Sirius Report perspective, I don't want anything to do with the alternative media. I don't want to engage in it because I just see it as being counterproductive. But there are people who see this third way and they are out there, and I want to join with them to get them, and then to get a bigger consensus of people who don't want to be on the extremes of anything, but see a different way and say, this is how we need to progress going forward. And to be honest, that is the future. I mean, just a small example, I'm sort of deviating here, and I put those, obviously you call it soccer. In the US, we have football. There's Manchester United player called Marcus Rashford. He's 22 years of age. And he was very passionate about having all these free school meals for that have gone on for very poor parents who the lowest rung. Okay, yeah, he earns a lot of money, but forget that. He made this big push, and he alone got the government to do a huge U-turn and go, we're going to continue with these free school meals during term time through the summer holidays to help the poorest people in the UK. You have a 22-year-old footballer with a brain and who cares about people and believes can make a government change. What can a collective of people change? That shows, okay, yeah, he's got a platform because he's famous. And therefore, but he was able to make the government U-turn. Now there's people who are out there who will disagree with what he said, how he did it. But in principle, it was a marvelous thing to see what one individual, albeit in a different position to what you and I are, CJ, and can make a difference. Well, that's the future, and that showed politics is dead. It offers nothing. It shows if you had a million Marcus Rashfords who all came together and said, we want this, we're sick of this has got to change. Governments would have to listen. They'd have no choice. But you're not going to achieve this by warring with each other, having riots and protests where you're all fighting and disagreeing. There needs to be a unified approach where everybody stands together and says, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. We don't want wars anymore. We want fair treatment of people. We want a health service fit for purpose. And we want everyone to have a basic quality of life. And we want you to deal with internal problems effectively. We want corporations to be held accountable. And if millions and millions of people agree, it will change. And that is the way it will change. And if for me, it's encouraging to see what one person in that position can do. And he was very public. He wrote an open letter. It was very well articulated, and it really laid out the problems. I mean, he himself grew up in a very poor family. They didn't have a lot of money, and he just said, "Look, this was my upbringing. This is what the life I had as a young person." Yeah, and of course, people will jump on the bandwagon and criticize and calling him privileged and calling him all these things. But the truth of the matter is, he still went out and did what he did, and that is for me, was a wonderful thing. For me, the disappointing thing is I tweeted it, hardly any response. That disappoints me, not because I want everyone to retweet what I'm saying, but I think that's an example of something that's very positive and something we can, you can grow and expand upon. And Marcus Rashford wants to extend this and do other things. And great, more power to him. He's, and he could be a footballer who goes, "Well, I've made it. I've got plenty of money. Why do I care about this anymore?" But the one thing that shows that he's very grounded, he hasn't lost touch with where he grew up as a child, and how his family didn't have money, how hard they had to work, and that's also a credit to his family and a credit to him. So you can criticize him in one sense, which I think is, unjustified anyway, but at least he's trying to do a good thing and a positive thing, and that is a beacon of light in this world which is why the hell have we got all these people brandishing all these conspiracy theories and frightening people half to death, and on the flip side, convincing everyone that, don't worry, don't do anything. Trump administration's got the plan. It's all under control. None of this. So why can't we see more of these things where people from every walk of life comes together and says, we don't agree with this. We've had enough of this and we want things to change. And they'll miraculously would change extremely quickly. But at the moment, I don't see that. I see very, very disaffected people. I see people on different sides of the fence. And unfortunately, we don't see any evidence they're going to come together and have these discussions. But the reason I've highlighted what this whole deep state thing is, it shows it's extremely fragile. And it shows why it continually fails, because it makes very poor decisions. It decides to embark on overseas escapades and everything else, and wars and all the hideous, disgusting things that go on. But they're failing, and therefore it proves they are vulnerable. But more importantly, they're vulnerable to enormous public opinion that says we can change these things. And how long have we said, CJ, that it's down to us as people to change things? So where's the enormous people in the alt media? They all moan, they all complain, they all go on about, oh, this horrendous deep state, all these things going to happen. How many of these people are actually trying to do something positive and bring people together and say we can make things change? Where are they? I don't see they exist. So what are they really doing? And I'm not saying there's people who don't follow these things who want this change, but I think there's elements within the alternative media who are just doing all they're doing to keep people frightened and to make them imagine that there's no hope. And then the flip side is there's all this hope. So in the end, neither side does anything. They all just sit there. Either they've given up, or either they just think it's all going to be dealt with, and then instead they're not dealing with problems. And why can't we have more and more groups of people who want to change, who want to see change, come together and with ideas and form peaceful movements, who go and protest peacefully, with whatever political persuasion you may have previously been, or whatever else you affiliate yourself to, and going, we don't need that anymore. Yep. So why not do that?
Yep. Paul, thank you for a great discussion today. I think it was a discussion that needed to be heard by many. And for our Gadfly subscribers, again, thank you for your support. You can comment directly here on this video or jump over to the forums to continue the conversation. And I'm right there with you, Paul, in terms of humanity waking up and assessing things and putting forth formidable change that can make a major difference. The challenge is we just have to get more people and I'm glad that you had this conversation today, because I know it'll resonate with many. So thank you, Paul.
Well, that's I mean, I'm going to keep doing the geopolitical stuff and the finance because I have to comment on what's happening in real time because that's what we do. But I think there's a great way where we can build a project. I want to go and find all these like-minded people with great ideas, and let's try and get people together. We can get more articles out, put them on the website, and have a different sort of angle as to how we galvanize those people. Because you know what? I think there is a lot of great people out there. I think a lot of them are turning around going, but where do I go? How can I form this kind of big, enormous group? We don't have to all be linked together in directly, but we have a loose affiliation, and we can get people to come on the Gadfly. Maybe they've got a platform, and we just trade ideas, discuss things, and build a consensus for a future that says it's not that I'm sorry, everything else has had its day. It's dead and buried. It's over. So let's stop trying to flog the proverbial dead horse to bring it back to life, because it's not the future. And if anyone still thinks that paradigm has any future, please get in touch, because I don't see in any way, shape, or form there's any future for this worn out, burnt out system that's absolutely abused humanity. It's completely failed humanity. And yet I see all these people still investing all this time and effort because they actually believe one side or the other is going to change everything. I mean, for me, it's astonishing. I haven't understood why anyone bought into this for 30 years. I mean, I was very young when I looked at the political system and went, this is bullshit. Why is anyone voting for this? And the amount of people who say to me, you can't, well, if you don't vote, you have no say in this political system. You have no right. I said, well, I'm not voting because I'm saying it's all nonsense. So I do have a say. I'm just telling you it's all nonsense, but that's how conditioned people are. It's always, it's a binary choice. You're left or right. You're Democrat, Republican. You're conservative, you're Labour. Not, and, hang on, I'm none of these. I'm not interested. I'm going to position myself in the middle, and I'm going to find the best aspects of everything and create a system that works for people. And you know what? It took a long time before I had anybody remotely sharing my viewpoint. And then gradually over years, we're starting to see it. But I have to say, for me, the progress in the last decade has been non-existent. There was kind of 2000 to 2010 or so, there was a lot of movement and a lot of ideas. And there are still people out there, don't get me wrong, it's not, what we're doing is not unique. But, and also I think particularly the last 4 years, everything's been hijacked to varying degrees, which has destroyed the whole purpose of what the so-called alternative media wants to do. So for me, I don't want anything to do with it anymore. I want to create and be part of a whole new way of looking at things. And as we say, bring everyone together and let's try something different, because there's a very good chance it will succeed. And who knows, if you make all the right noise, you might get some buy-in from some pretty influential people who've had enough as well. And when you start to do that, very quickly something pretty extraordinary can be born from this. And if now is more than ever is the time to do it, I don't think there's any other point in history where there isn't an absolute screaming need for this to be done.
Yep. Paul, thank you so much, and have a great day.
And yourself.